A young housekeeper named Claire is caught sleeping in a billionaire's penthouse bed, an innocent mistake that spirals into scandal, betrayal, and a battle for her dignity. As whispers turn cruel and her life unravels, the last person she expects, Nathan, the man who could have ruined her, offers her something she never dared hope for: trust, respect, and a chance to reclaim her worth. But will she be brave enough to step out of the shadows? Where are you listening from today? Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that might change how you see yourself. Rain lashed the tall windows of the Bellamy Tower Hotel, a gleaming fortress of glass and marble that rose 30 stories above the downtown Chicago skyline. Inside, the lobby shimmered with polished stone floors and chandeliers the size of small cars, their crystals refracting light in 1,000 directions. The air smelled faintly of citrus polish and fresh-cut flowers, an aroma designed to make every guest feel like royalty. But for Claire Marino, none of that mattered. She stepped off the staff elevator, her uniform clinging damply to her back after 12 hours of scrubbing, lifting, and carrying. The cart in front of her squeaked every few feet, a little shrill cry she was too tired to care about anymore. She moved past the velvet ropes, past the discreet security cameras, her black flats sticking slightly to the marble. Claire had been here less than 3 weeks, and already the Bellamy was wearing her down the way only a place of relentless luxury could, by reminding her with every gleaming surface that she did not belong. She was 25, but tonight she felt much older. Her limbs heavy, her shoulders locked tight against the ache in her muscles. The hallway lighting was low and warm, casting buttery shadows over the brass fixtures and damask wallpaper, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was how much her feet hurt, how her skin was hot in a way that wasn't just exhaustion. She knew she was getting sick. It had started that morning, with a rawness in her throat she'd ignored. Now her temples throbbed with fever and every breath felt ragged. "Claire," a voice snapped behind her. She turned, blinking to clear her vision. Paula, the senior housekeeping supervisor, stood with a clipboard clutched to her chest. Paula had the kind of face that never smiled, a mouth pinched in permanent disapproval. Her eyes flicked up and down Claire's wrinkled uniform. "You're on penthouse duty," she said briskly. "Suite 3201. The guest arrives tomorrow. Management wants it immaculate." Claire opened her mouth to protest. The penthouse was usually reserved for senior staff, and she had already cleaned 11 rooms today. But before she could speak, Paula arched one brow, daring her to argue. Claire swallowed her words. "Yes, ma'am," she said instead, her voice hoarse. Paula thrust the keycard into her hand and walked away, the staccato click of her heels echoing down the corridor. Claire stood still for a moment, trying to summon the energy to keep moving. She thought about her grandmother back home in Cicero, about the medicine she couldn't afford if she lost this job. That was enough to force her legs into motion again. She pushed the cart down the long, silent hallway, every step feeling like she was wading through syrup. When she reached the private elevator, she swiped the card and waited as the doors whispered open. Inside, the elevator smelled faintly of expensive cologne. The ride to the top was smooth, but the silence pressed in around her, a hush so complete it magnified the hammering of her pulse. She closed her eyes, took a breath that rattled in her chest. Just a little longer, she told herself. Just finish this last room. The elevator chimed, and she stepped out into a corridor that looked nothing like the rest of the hotel. Here, the walls were paneled in dark walnut, the sconces shaped like antique lanterns. A plush runner stretched the length of the hallway, absorbing her footsteps. She slid the keycard into the lock of 3201. There was a soft click, and the door swung open with a sigh. The penthouse looked like something out of a design magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panorama of rain-lashed skyscrapers and twinkling traffic far below. A massive sectional sofa sat in front of a sleek gas fireplace, the hearth lined with white marble. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel and black granite counters. On the dining table, a silver vase held a perfect arrangement of white orchids. For a moment, Claire simply stood there, staring. She had cleaned luxury suites before, but this was different, more refined, more intimate. She almost felt as if she were intruding. Shaking herself, she parked her cart by the door and set to work. She replaced the towels in the master bath, polished every chrome fixture until it gleamed. She wiped the glass coffee table 3 times, even though she couldn't see a single speck of dust. She aligned the throw pillows with painstaking precision. The fever crept higher, a dull heat spreading down her spine. Her hands trembled when she folded the last blanket, and black spots swam across her vision. She stumbled into the bathroom, bracing her hands on the cold edge of the sink. Her reflection looked ghostly, her cheeks blotched with red, her hair stuck to her forehead. She couldn't go home like this, not on the train. She looked at the stack of thick white towels on the shelf, then back at her own sweat-soaked uniform. It would take 5 minutes, she thought. Just rinse out her blouse so she wouldn't stink on the ride home. She peeled off the damp fabric and held it under warm water, watching the suds swirl down the drain. When she wrung it out, her arms felt weak, rubbery. Her bra and undershirt were soaked, clinging to her skin. She shivered, despite the fever. On a hook behind the door hung a plush white hotel robe, embroidered with the Bellamy crest. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might appear to scold her. But she was alone. Just for a minute, she told herself. She slipped it on, savoring the way the softness cushioned her burning skin. She meant to sit for a moment while her clothes dried, but when she perched on the edge of the mattress dipped beneath her, warm and welcoming. Her body, so used to standing, nearly wept with relief. She thought, 1 minute, just one. She laid back carefully, folding her hands over her stomach. The rain beyond the windows blurred into a gray curtain. Her eyelids fluttered. Sleep swallowed her before she could resist. She didn't hear the elevator arrive, didn't hear the soft hush of expensive shoes crossing the walnut floor. Nathan Hale stepped into the suite with the quiet assurance of someone who had always belonged in rooms like this. He was 27, tall, his suit the color of midnight and cut to fit the lean lines of his frame. His jaw was clean-shaven, his hair damp from the rain, and in his hand he carried a phone he barely glanced at. He paused, frowning. The air smelled different, less of orchid and polish, more human, faintly warm. His gaze swept the room with a practiced eye. Nothing seemed amiss until he turned toward the bed. There, beneath the pale duvet, a woman lay curled on her side. One arm draped loosely over the sheet, the robe slipping off her shoulder to reveal smooth skin. For a beat, Nathan didn't move. Suspicion sparked behind his eyes. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to ambush him. His success attracted all kinds: journalists, opportunists, women who thought a scandal might yield a settlement. He approached slowly, noting every detail. The damp towel in the bathroom, the blouse draped over the sink, the flushed cheeks of the sleeping woman. She didn't look like a seductress. She looked ill, vulnerable. "Wake up," he said, his voice low and clipped. She didn't stir. He tried again, louder, nothing. Finally, he reached out, placing 2 fingers lightly on her bare shoulder. Her skin burned under his touch. Her eyes snapped open, huge and glassy, and for one suspended instant they stared at each other. Then she gasped, lurching upright. The robe slipped further down her chest. She clutched the blanket to her throat, her face a mask of horror. "I'm sorry," she blurted, her voice ragged. I didn't know anyone was here. I thought the room was empty. My supervisor sent me." Nathan didn't move, his expression unreadable. She stammered, her breath coming in shallow gulps. "I was tired. I didn't mean." "Put your clothes on," he said evenly, "and leave." She blinked as if she hadn't heard. Then she nodded, fumbling for her uniform with shaking hands. Nathan turned away, his jaw tight, and walked to the far windows. He didn't look back. Behind him, he could hear her ragged breathing, the rustle of fabric, the stifled sob she tried to swallow. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. This was not how his night was supposed to go. But even as he tried to dismiss it, tried to tell himself she was just another problem to be managed, he couldn't shake the look in her eyes. That look wasn't calculated, it wasn't theatrical, it was real. And as she fled, her footsteps uneven, Nathan knew this wasn't over. Claire barely remembered how she made it back down to the staff locker room. The elevator ride blurred into a long, airless tunnel, her heart hammering in her throat. She stumbled through the service corridor, gripping the keycard so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she pushed through the locker room door, a dozen pairs of eyes lifted from their phones and conversations. every gaze narrowing in curious suspicion. Her blouse was half damp, her hair matted to her temples, the robe gone, but the embarrassment clinging to her like a second skin. She tried not to look at anyone, tried not to hear the hush that fell over the space as she crossed to her locker. Her hands trembled so badly she could hardly work the lock. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The worst was over, she told herself. She'd been caught in a humiliating situation, yes, but she had explained. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't done anything except fall asleep, too sick and too exhausted to stand. But as she peeled off the damp robe and pulled her blouse over her head, a sour realization curdled in her stomach. None of it mattered. The truth was powerless in a place like this, where appearances were everything and perception was reality. She'd barely managed to button the last button when Paula's voice crackled over the intercom mounted near the ceiling. "Claire Moreno, my office. Now." The words dropped like stones into the quiet. A few of the other maids glanced at each other, their expressions pinched with something between pity and grim curiosity. Gina, who had never liked her, didn't bother to hide her smirk. Claire drew a breath she hoped would steady her. It didn't. She set her shoulders, closed her locker, and forced her feet to move. The hallway leading to Paula's office was painted a dull cream color, the kind that made everything look tired. Claire pressed her palm to the cool metal of the door for a moment before she knocked and stepped inside. Paula was behind her desk, arms folded tight across her chest, her expression carved from granite. Next to her stood a man in a dark gray suit with a hotel security badge clipped to his breast pocket. He held a slim tablet in his hand, the screen dark. His face was impassive but not kind. Paula didn't ask Claire to sit. She let the silence stretch until Claire thought she would choke on it. Finally, Paula said, "Do you have any idea the trouble you've caused?" Claire opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Her throat felt raw. "He walked in and found you in his bed," Paula continued, each word deliberate and heavy. "Wearing a robe, no less. You were supposed to clean the suite, not turn it into your personal spa." "I was sick," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. I thought it was empty. I only sat down for a minute." "Save it." Paula's voice cracked like a whip. She turned to the security officer, who lifted the tablet and tapped the screen. An image sprang to life, a grainy security still from the hallway camera. It showed Claire wheeling her cart into the penthouse suite, her head down, shoulders slumped. "No one saw you leave," Paula said icily. "The guest returned and found you there. What exactly did you expect him to think?" Claire's ears rang. She felt like she was underwater, her heartbeat a dull, insistent pounding behind her eyes. "I didn't expect anything," she said, though she knew the words were hopeless. The guest has not filed a formal complaint," Paula said, cutting her off, "but that doesn't mean we're clear. You've humiliated the Bellamy. If he chooses to escalate this, we are prepared to terminate your employment immediately." The man in the suit shifted slightly, as if expecting her to protest, but Claire couldn't find the energy to argue. Her knees threatened to give out. She reached for the corner of the desk to steady herself, swallowing back the nausea rising in her throat. Paula watched her with something close to disdain. "Until further notice, you are suspended without pay. Leave your access badge on the table. You will be contacted by HR when a determination has been made." Just like that. No hearing. No chance to defend herself beyond this shameful recital. Claire felt something inside her collapse. Not just fear, something deeper, older. The feeling that no matter how hard she tried to keep her life stitched together, it would always unravel in her hands. She pulled her badge from the lanyard around her neck, laying it on the table. It looked small and pathetic against the glossy wood. She lifted her chin just enough to meet Paula's gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, though she doubted Paula cared. "Go," Paula said flatly. Claire walked out on unsteady legs, the corridor tilting around her. The locker room was almost empty now, the late shift having moved on to their rounds. She didn't look at anyone. She gathered her things with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. It took her 3 tries to zip her canvas bag. The entire time, she could feel Gina's stare from across the room. By the time she stepped out into the staff exit, the rain had turned to sleet, slapping cold against her cheeks. She didn't bother with an umbrella. She let it soak through her hair, down her collar, until she was numb all over. She took the train home, pressed into a corner by the doors, her bag clutched to her chest. No one spoke to her, which she was grateful for. She was certain that if someone had asked her if she was okay, she would have started crying and never stopped. Her apartment was a cramped third-floor walk-up in an old brick building that smelled of damp plaster and stale cooking oil. She kicked off her soaked shoes and collapsed onto the narrow futon. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the mini-fridge and the slow drip of a leak in the kitchen sink she hadn't had time to fix. She pulled a blanket over her shoulders, shivering. She thought of her grandmother, of the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. She thought of the way Nathan Hale had looked at her, flat and cold, as if she were something he'd scraped off his shoe. She thought of Paula's voice, biting and certain. "You've humiliated this hotel." She closed her eyes, wishing she could erase the whole evening, wipe it clean from her memory. But the shame stayed lodged in her ribs, a dull ache she couldn't soothe. Hours passed. She drifted in and out of shallow, fevered sleep. At some point, she must have dozed off completely because she woke to darkness, her phone buzzing beside her. The screen glowed with a notification from an unknown number. She didn't pick it up. She didn't want to see another message telling her she'd been fired, or worse, some lawyer's notice that she was being charged with trespassing. Eventually, she mustered the strength to get up. She reheated a can of soup she couldn't taste, her throat too raw. She told herself this was temporary. She had survived worse. She could survive this. But the certainty didn't come. Across town, Nathan sat in the penthouse he'd reclaimed. The lights turned low, a tumbler of scotch untouched on the table beside him. He had tried to immerse himself in the financial reports stacked in his briefcase, but the numbers swam past without meaning. His mind returned again and again to the image of her face when she'd woken, pale, startled, utterly exposed. It hadn't looked like the face of someone playing a con. It looked like a woman who had run out of places to run. He didn't know why he cared. He told himself he shouldn't. He had no room for distraction, no patience for sentiment. But something about it, about her, had stuck. When the clock on the mantel clicked past 2 in the morning, he picked up the phone and dialed the hotel's night manager. "Mr. Hale," the voice answered, instantly formal. "I want to know what action has been taken regarding the incident this evening." Nathan said, keeping his tone carefully neutral. "Sir, the housekeeper was suspended pending investigation. And she will be dismissed?" "Most likely. We take these breaches of protocol very seriously." Nathan was silent a moment. He pressed his thumb hard against the edge of the table, grounding himself in the sting. "Make sure she is not terminated," he said at last. "Sir?" "You heard me," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "If you need to discipline her, do it, but she keeps her job." The manager hesitated. "Very well, I'll see to it." Nathan ended the call and leaned back in his chair. He exhaled slowly, feeling something shift in his chest. Relief, maybe, or an unease he couldn't name. He didn't want her gratitude. He didn't even want her to know he'd intervened. But he couldn't stomach the idea of her being thrown out into the cold over a single tired mistake. The rain finally stopped as dawn crept over the skyline, turning the windows pale gold. In her small apartment, Claire lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, certain that her world had ended. Neither of them knew it yet, but the worst night of her life had just set something in motion neither could have predicted. The next morning, Claire woke to a brittle ache in her chest and a throat as dry as old paper. The gray dawn pushed its way through the thin blinds, illuminating the scattered evidence of her exhaustion. Her uniform crumpled on the chair, the soup bowl still on the counter, her phone blinking with a missed call she hadn't dared return. For a few moments, she let herself believe she could simply stay there in her cocoon of blankets, invisible to the world. But reality had a way of showing up whether she was ready or not. When she finally peeled herself out of bed and dressed in her spare uniform, her limbs felt hollow. The train ride back to the Bellamy was a blur of noise and movement she couldn't process. She kept her eyes fixed on her reflection in the dark glass of the window, studying the tired lines at the corners of her mouth. She looked like a woman who had lost something, though she couldn't have said what it was exactly. She expected to be stopped at the employee entrance, but no one blocked her way. Inside the locker room, conversations faltered and died when she stepped through the door. Gina raised her brows pointedly but said nothing, which felt worse than an insult. Claire didn't bother trying to explain herself. She placed her bag in her locker and sat on the narrow bench to lace her shoes, forcing her hands to be steady. A few minutes later, Paula strode in, a sheet of paper in one hand. Without preamble, she held it out. "Your new assignment," she said coolly, "effective immediately." Claire's throat tightened as she read the schedule. Her name appeared again and again beside the same words, Penthouse level service. She lifted her gaze, bewildered. "I don't understand. Am I being punished?" Paula's lips pressed together, her expression unreadable. "It's an assignment," she repeated. "Take it or leave it." The implication was clear. If Claire wanted her job, she would have to accept. She nodded, folding the schedule with careful hands. She would rather clean the penthouse 10 times over than go back to Cicero and explain to her grandmother why the bills would go unpaid. She tried not to think about the man who had found her there. Tried not to picture the look in his eyes, that chill, assessing detachment. As she rolled her cart into the private elevator, her pulse tapped at the hollow of her throat. The doors closed, sealing her inside a metal capsule that hummed steadily as it rose. For a second, she considered pressing the button to go back down, to ask for another floor, any other floor. But the thought of Paula's expression, impatient, already convinced she was a problem, kept her rooted. The elevator chimed, and the doors parted on the penthouse corridor. The air up here was different, almost reverent in its quiet. Every polished surface seemed to gleam brighter, every arrangement of flowers perfectly still. She pushed her cart forward, the wheels muffled by the thick carpeting. As she cleaned, she moved with painstaking care, double-checking every corner, smoothing every crease in the duvet until her fingers hurt. In her mind, she rehearsed what she would say if she encountered him again. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again. I'm just here to do my job." But each time she pictured his face, her resolve shrank. She could handle being dismissed, ignored, but she couldn't bear to be judged. Hours passed. She moved from one suite to the next, folding towels, polishing chrome. She let the rhythm of the work soothe her, grounding her in something she could control. But as afternoon slipped into evening, her anxiety began to coil tighter. She was almost done with her last room when a call crackled over the staff radio, clipped her waistband. Moreno, the receptionist's voice came, uncertain. "Mr. Hale has requested dinner service in the penthouse. He asked for you specifically." Claire's heart sank. For a moment she simply stood there, her hands wrapped around a folded pillowcase. She thought of refusing. She had every right to say no, didn't she? But the reality of her situation pressed down like a stone. She needed this job. She needed to be the kind of employee who did not cause trouble. "Copy," she said softly. She gathered the dinner tray herself, her hands trembling as she arranged the covered dishes. Her reflection caught in the polished silver domes, pale skin, drawn mouth, dark eyes wide with dread. She pressed her palms to her cheeks to warm them, took a breath, and wheeled the cart to the suite door. Her knuckles hovered over the wood for a long moment before she knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Nathan Hale stood framed in the doorway, dressed in a charcoal shirt without a tie, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. His hair was still damp from the rain, as if he had only just arrived. His gaze landed on her face and did not waver. "Come in," he said, his voice low. She swallowed and pushed the cart over the threshold. The suite smelled of warm bread and something herbal. She moved to set the tray on the dining table, her hands careful, her eyes fixed on the white tablecloth. I'll just leave this here," she said, already turning to retreat. "Stay." The single word was soft, but it froze her in place. She turned slowly, heart galloping. "I don't think that's appropriate." "I know," he said. For the first time there was no coldness in his tone, only something that sounded almost weary. "But I'd rather not eat alone tonight." Her chest tightened, confusion and dread tangling together. "Sir, just sit," he said gently. "You don't have to say anything." She hesitated, every instinct telling her to flee. But the tired slope of his shoulders made her pause. Slowly, she pulled out the opposite chair and lowered herself into it. She folded her hands in her lap, knuckles pale. Nathan poured wine into 2 glasses but did not push one toward her. He sat back, studying her as if she were some question he hadn't yet solved. The silence stretched between them, threaded with something neither of them knew how to name. She tried not to fidget under his gaze. "If this is about what happened—" "It isn't," he interrupted. "Not entirely." She bit the inside of her cheek. She wanted to ask why he'd requested her, why he hadn't simply had her fired, but she couldn't force the words out. Instead, she stared at her reflection in the polished fork beside her plate, wishing she were anywhere else. "I don't usually do this," he said finally. "Call someone up, ask them to sit." "I don't usually fall asleep in penthouse beds," she murmured, her voice so small it was almost a joke. To her surprise, something that looked like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was fleeting, there and gone again, but it softened him. "Fair enough," he said. The conversation didn't go further. He began to eat, methodical and silent. She sat unmoving, too aware of the way her presence must look. If anyone came in, Paula, Gina, even another guest, it would be a scandal she couldn't ever outrun. But Nathan didn't seem concerned. When he finally looked up, his gaze held none of the judgment she expected. Only curiosity, edged with something softer. "You're not like the others," he said. Her breath caught. "The others? The ones who try to impress me, who act like they're not watching when they are." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't pretend." She looked down at her hands. "I was just trying to do my job." "That's what I liked," he said quietly. Heat rose in her cheeks, a flush she couldn't control. She forced herself to look up. "People will talk," she whispered. "They already are." His expression didn't change. "I know." The quiet stretched between them, thick as the rain tapping the windows. She wished he would dismiss her, wished he would say something definitive so she could go back to her life, however fractured it was. But he didn't. Instead, when she finally stood, intending to leave, he didn't stop her. He only said, "Claire." She paused in the doorway, her hand on the polished brass handle. "If you'd rather I didn't request you again, say so." She turned her head, searching his face for mockery or pity. She found neither. Only a calm, unguarded honesty that made her throat ache. "I don't know," she whispered. He nodded once, as if he understood perfectly. She slipped out before her courage could fail, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Out in the hall, she leaned against the wall, pressing her palm to her racing heart. She didn't know what any of it meant. His request, his silence, the way he had looked at her as though he was seeing something she couldn't. All she knew was that something had shifted, and no amount of scrubbing or denial would put it back where it belonged. The next morning, Claire arrived early, hoping that the quiet of dawn might help her slip in unnoticed. But the minute she stepped into the locker room, she could feel the shift in the air, the way conversation paused and eyes slid toward her before darting away again. A hush spread in her wake like an oil slick. She tried not to let it touch her, tried not to wonder what stories were already taking shape behind other people's polite smiles. Gina stood by the sinks, her hair pinned into its usual severe knot. She didn't say anything at first, just watched Claire with an expression too carefully neutral to be anything but deliberate. As Claire turned her key in her locker, Gina's voice drifted over, mild as poisoned honey. "Penthouse again today?" she asked. "Must be nice to have such favorable assignments." Claire stiffened but kept her back turned. "I don't choose where I'm sent." Gina made a little hum in her throat. "No, I suppose you don't." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Some of us have to work for years to get trusted with those sweets." Claire bit down hard on her tongue. She knew if she looked up, she'd see the smirk waiting there, the gloating satisfaction of someone who thought she'd won something just by watching Claire squirm. Instead, she closed her locker gently and turned away without another word. But as she walked down the hall, she could still feel Gina's eyes on her, hot and accusing. All morning, she tried to lose herself in her work. She dusted and folded and straightened, every motion precise. When she finished each suite, she checked it twice. But no amount of discipline could scrub away the low thrum of dread building in her ribs, the knowledge that the rumors were spreading faster than she could hope to outrun. By mid-afternoon, she was almost grateful when she heard her radio crackle. "Moreno," the receptionist's voice came, weary and unsurprised. "Mr. Hale has requested a tea service, Penthouse. Her stomach dropped. For a moment, she considered refusing, making some excuse. But she knew it would only feed the story that she was hiding something. So she said, "Copy," as steadily as she could, and began preparing the tray. When she reached the suite, she knocked twice, her knuckles brushing the wood. A beat passed before the door opened, and Nathan Hale stood there, dressed in a dark sweater and slacks, his expression difficult to read. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stepped back, holding the door for her. She entered, her eyes fixed firmly on the tray in her hands. "Where would you like this?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. "Anywhere," he said, his tone quiet. She set the tray on the coffee table and straightened, ready to excuse herself. But before she could take a step, she heard herself asking the question that had been simmering in her chest for days. "Why do you keep asking for me?" He didn't answer immediately. She forced herself to look up and found his gaze fixed on her, unblinking. "Because you don't pretend," he said finally. "Because you don't try to impress me or flatter me, and because I don't like liars." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this was only about professionalism. But she knew how it looked. She knew what everyone thought. "People are starting to talk," she whispered. "It's becoming a problem." His brow furrowed slightly. "For them or for you?" She swallowed. "Both. If you want me to stop, I will." The offer hung between them, and for a moment she wished she could say yes, that she wanted nothing more than to return to her old life of invisibility. But the truth was more complicated. Even when it terrified her, part of her had started to feel something in his presence she didn't have words for, something like recognition. "I don't know what this is," she said finally, her voice shaking. "Neither do I," he admitted. That somehow made it worse, because it meant neither of them knew how to contain it or what damage it might do. She left without saying anything more. The hallway outside felt too bright, the hush of the penthouse corridor pressing down on her like a held breath. As she turned the corner, she almost collided with Gina, who stood there, arms folded, her smile thin and triumphant. "Delivering special orders again?" she asked sweetly. Claire didn't reply. She kept walking, though her chest burned. The next day, she arrived to find her locker door ajar. Her heart thudded as she reached out to push it open, and her stomach twisted when she saw what lay inside. Someone had taken her name badge, and in its place was a torn scrap of hotel stationery with a single word scrawled across it in thick, angry letters: "Slut." For a moment, all the strength she'd been clinging to deserted her. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal, eyes squeezed shut. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But her hands trembled as she tore the note into pieces and stuffed it in her pocket. She knew exactly who had done it, but accusing Gina wouldn't change anything. It would only make her look defensive, guilty. So she forced herself to gather her supplies and pretend nothing was wrong. That afternoon, when the dinner service came late, she wasn't the one assigned to deliver it. Relief washed through her. Maybe it was finally over. Maybe he'd decided to distance himself, for both their sakes. She tried to ignore the hollow ache the thought left behind. But 20 minutes later, the phone at the reception desk rang, and her stomach dropped when she heard the page. "Moreno, Penthouse. Mr. Hale has requested you." The other housekeeper who'd taken the tray looked up, her mouth twitching with curiosity. Claire didn't meet her eyes. She walked to the elevator, her palms damp. When she reached the suite, she found Nathan standing by the window, his back to her. The lights of the city spread out in a glittering net beyond the glass. "Why didn't you come?" he asked without turning. Her voice felt small. "I wasn't on the list." He turned then, his expression calm but edged with something that looked almost like frustration. "I changed the list," she swallowed. "Someone's trying to intimidate me." "Yes," he said simply. He picked up a tablet from the table and handed it to her. The screen showed a grainy security feed, Gina slipping into the locker room after hours, something white clutched in her hand. Claire's breath caught. "How did you get this?" "I asked," he said. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She'd suspected, but seeing proof made it real in a way she hadn't been ready for. "You can let them push you out," Nathan said quietly. "Or you can stop running." She looked up, really looked at him. For the first time, she saw not just the CEO everyone feared, but a man who had made space for her again and again without ever asking for anything in return. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. A flicker of something, approval, maybe, passed over his face. He inclined his head once, as though they had struck some private accord. Then he turned back to the window, dismissing her without words. But as she left, the weight in her chest felt lighter, the fear less suffocating. For the first time since that terrible night, she felt like she might survive this. The feeling lasted exactly one day. The following afternoon, the revolving doors of the Bellamy's swept open, and Veronica Sinclair walked in like a woman who owned every square inch of marble beneath her stiletto heels. She wore a crimson coat that fell to mid-calf and lipstick to match, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek twist. Every head in the lobby turned, and no one pretended not to look. Claire was delivering fresh linens to the penthouse when the elevator doors behind her slid open. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Veronica stepped out, her eyes sweeping the hall until they landed on Claire. "Oh," she said softly, her voice dripping with amusement. "You must be the new help." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came. Veronica didn't wait for a reply. She brushed past her as if she were a piece of furniture, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. "Julian," she called, her voice bright and practiced as she strode into the suite. Claire stood frozen, linen bundle clutched to her chest, as the door swung shut behind the woman, who until that moment she had only seen on gossip sites. Her legs felt weak, her thoughts scattered. She set the linens carefully on the service cart and turned to leave, telling herself none of this had anything to do with her. But as she stepped into the elevator, she couldn't shake the echo of Veronica's voice, the mocking curl of her smile. Some part of her knew, even before she heard the words, that nothing would ever be the same again. Claire didn't remember walking back to the staff corridor. Her hands were still tingling where the bundle of linens had pressed into her palms, and her pulse throbbed in her throat, as if she'd run up every flight of stairs in the building. In her mind, she replayed the moment the elevator doors had opened. Veronica Sinclair's perfect red smile, the cool dismissal in her gaze. She'd never met a woman so composed, so surgically confident. Even now, long after the encounter, Claire felt as though she was covered in a fine layer of invisible ash, marked by something she didn't understand. When she reached the locker room, she was relieved to find it empty. She sank onto the bench, trying to steady her breathing. Part of her wanted to believe that was the end of it, that Veronica's visit had nothing to do with her, that she was only another housekeeper, irrelevant to people like them. But another part knew better. She'd seen the way Nathan's eyes had softened around the edges when he looked at her, and she'd seen the way Veronica's had narrowed in response. Gina must have been waiting for her to return, because the moment Claire stepped into the main hallway with her cart, she appeared as if conjured, her smile thin and glinting. "Long day?" she asked, her tone falsely pleasant. Claire didn't answer. She set her jaw and kept moving, but Gina fell into step beside her. "Funny, isn't it? All these years, I thought the fastest way upstairs was a promotion. Turns out it's a smile and a little self-respect you don't mind trading in." Heat flooded Claire's face. "You don't know anything about me." "Don't I?" Gina's eyebrows arched. "Everyone knows. We all see you scurrying up there every time he calls. What do you think it looks like?" Claire bit back a retort. It didn't matter what she said. The story was already written in everyone's minds. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure she could blame them. Even she didn't understand why Nathan kept asking for her. She finished her shift in a haze, moving automatically through the motions, folding towels, wiping counters, collecting glassware. When she finally clocked out, the sky was already deepening to violet, the first stars emerging between the tall buildings. She walked to the train station without looking back, willing herself not to feel the eyes she imagined following her. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay on her narrow mattress, her body exhausted, but her thoughts sparking and leaping like live wires. She knew she couldn't go on like this, caught between the humiliations of gossip and the fear that any misstep would cost her the job she still desperately needed. And beneath all of it was something she couldn't name. Something that looked like longing, even though she tried to pretend it was only gratitude. She was still awake when her phone buzzed, vibrating across the crate she used for a nightstand. She reached for it, half expecting another cruel text or an anonymous warning, but the number was unlisted. "Claire, it's Nathan." Her heart tripped over itself. She read the message twice before her thumbs began to move. "What do you want?" A long pause. Then, "To talk, please." She set the phone down and pressed her hands over her face. She didn't reply. The next day, she arrived at work determined to stay invisible. She kept her head down, finished her tasks without lingering, and avoided the penthouse floor altogether. But just after lunch, the receptionist called her over. "You have a delivery," the woman said, her voice curious. Claire frowned. "A delivery?" The receptionist handed her a slim black envelope with her name written in neat, unfamiliar script. She turned it over in her hands, feeling a rush of cold dread. Part of her wanted to throw it away unopened, but she knew she wouldn't. Inside was a folded card. On one side, a note in Nathan's handwriting. "Come upstairs. No expectations, just a conversation." Her fingers curled tightly around the edges. She could almost hear Gina's voice in her head, mocking and certain. She closed her eyes and counted to 10. When she opened them again, she knew what she was going to do. That evening, after her shift officially ended, she took the service elevator to the top floor. The hallway was empty, hushed. She hesitated outside the suite, her hand poised to knock. For a moment, she considered turning around, riding the elevator down, and never coming back. But then she remembered the look in Veronica's eyes, the assumption that Claire was just a toy to be discarded, and something inside her stiffened. She knocked once softly. The door opened almost immediately. Nathan stood there in a white dress shirt with the cuffs undone, the top buttons open at his throat. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, and for one unsettling moment she wondered if he was as lost in this as she was. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her. The suite was lit with a soft glow. Lamps dimmed, shadows pooling in the corners. The scent of something earthy and warm drifted through the air. "I don't think this is a good idea," she said before he could speak. "Probably not," he admitted, "but I didn't want to let it end without at least trying to explain." She lifted her chin. "Explain what?" He exhaled slowly. "Why I keep asking for you." Claire's throat felt too tight. "You don't owe me anything." "That's where you're wrong," he said. "I owe you honesty." He gestured to the sofa. She didn't sit, but he did, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't look like the man in the glossy magazine profiles, the one with the razor-sharp suits and the polished charm. He looked tired, stripped of all the armor. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who want something from me," he began. "Partnerships, favors, a headline, and I've learned how to manage that, how to anticipate it." She didn't interrupt. "But you," his gaze lifted to hers, steady. "You never asked for anything, even when it would have been easier." "I asked to be left alone," she said, her voice low. He nodded once. "And I respected that. But I also knew if I let you disappear, I'd regret it." Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She didn't know how to reply. "You don't have to stay," he said finally. "If this is too much, if it feels like pressure, I'll let you go." And for a moment, she was tempted to walk out, to reclaim the small, safe life she'd built in the margins. But when she tried to picture it, she saw only the same dull ache that had haunted her since the night he found her asleep in his bed. "I'm not sure what you expect from me," she whispered. "Nothing you don't want to give," he said. Silence unfurled between them, wide and fragile. At last, she sat down on the edge of the chair opposite him. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "People will talk," she said. "They already are." Her gaze met his. "And when they say I'm here because you wanted someone convenient?" He held her eyes without flinching. "Then let them." She swallowed hard. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." His expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. "Then I'll be strong enough for both of us." She didn't have an answer for that, and for once, he didn't seem to expect one. They sat in the hush of the penthouse, the city sprawling beyond the windows in a wash of midnight blue and pinprick lights. When she finally rose to leave, he didn't try to stop her. But as she reached the door, his voice came, low and certain. "Claire?" She turned. I'm offering you something better than hiding, he said. A place to stand where you don't have to pretend. Her throat closed. She couldn't bring herself to say yes, but she couldn't make herself say no either. So she nodded once, just enough to let him see she'd heard him, and slipped out into the corridor. As she walked back to the staff elevator, her heart was a wild, bewildered thing. She knew the rumors would double by morning, that Gina's smirk would grow sharper. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something almost like relief. Because whatever happened next, it would be because she had chosen it, not because she'd been cornered. When she reached her locker, she found another note taped across the vent. This one was neater, the handwriting controlled and unfamiliar. You can't outrun what you are. Her hands trembled as she peeled it free, crumpling it into her fist. And yet, as she tossed it in the trash, she thought of Nathan's voice, the quiet certainty in it, and felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared hope for in a long time. Something like defiance. That night, Claire lay awake in her narrow bed, the glow from the street lamp outside her window washing everything in a pale, uneasy light. She thought she was past crying, that she'd already emptied herself of every humiliation and fear she could possibly feel. But as the hours ticked by, something bitter and hot built behind her eyes. She pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead, willing it to stop. Nothing helped. In the quiet, her mind replayed the evening in Nathan's suite. The careful way he'd spoken, as though he didn't want to spook her. The steadiness in his eyes when he said he owed her honesty. And beneath all of it, the unspoken knowledge that she didn't really belong in his world, no matter how gently he tried to convince her otherwise. When the dawn finally crept over the rooftops, she felt wrung out like a rag left too long in soapy water. But she still got up. Still dressed in her uniform and tied her hair back. There was nothing else to do. She had no savings, no backup plan, no family who could step in if she gave up. So she put one foot in front of the other and told herself that was enough. The Bellamy was busy when she arrived. Businessmen in tailored suits checking out, tourists snapping photos in the gilded lobby. She kept her gaze down, ignoring the quiet ripple of curiosity that followed her whenever she passed a group of staff. By now, everyone had an opinion, and she didn't have the energy to disprove any of them. Gina wasn't in the locker room when Claire slipped inside to hang her coat, but someone had scrawled a word in permanent marker across the metal of her locker door. War. The letters were large, slanted, still shining faintly as if the ink hadn't dried yet. Her chest tightened. But she didn't let herself look around to see if anyone was watching. She picked up a rag and cleaning spray and began to scrub. The letters smeared, then faded. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling so badly she had to sit on the bench, her shoulders hunched. When she finally forced herself to stand, she found Paula waiting near the doorway, arms folded. The older woman's expression was stony as always, but there was a flicker of something that might have been regret in her eyes. "You have an assignment," she said. "Dinner service for 3201. Claire almost laughed. Of course it would be the Penthouse. She wondered if they'd ever let her do anything else again. But she only nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As she prepared the tray, she felt her mind split along two tracks. One part of her was meticulously arranging the cutlery, counting each glass, checking the linen napkin for stains. The other was asking the same question over and over. Why am I still here? It was nearly sunset when she knocked on the penthouse door. This time, she didn't hesitate. Whatever happened, she would face it with her eyes open. Nathan answered almost immediately, as though he'd been waiting. He wore a dark gray sweater over black slacks, his hair still damp from a shower. When he saw her, he didn't smile. But the tension in his posture eased. "Come in," he said quietly. She stepped inside and set the tray on the dining table. The suite smelled of roasted garlic and herbs, the scent warm and comforting in a way that made her throat ache. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, her voice steady only because she was too tired to let it shake. "Yes," he said, and something in his tone made her look up. "I need you to stay." She folded her hands in front of her apron. "Nathan, just dinner," he said. "Just stay." She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. "Why? So everyone can have more to talk about?" "Because I'm tired of pretending this doesn't matter," he said, his voice low but unflinching. That was the thing that finally broke her composure. She let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "You don't even know me." He didn't argue. He only pulled out the chair across from his and waited. Against her better judgment, against the little voice screaming that she was making everything worse, she sat down. They didn't speak for a long time. He poured wine for them both, though she didn't touch hers. He served her a portion of roasted chicken and vegetables, but she only picked at the edges of the plate. At last, he set down his fork. "You're right. I don't know everything about you." She kept her gaze fixed on her hands. "But I know you've spent your entire life working harder than anyone gives you credit for. I know you're braver than you think." Her throat closed. "That doesn't change what people believe." "No," he agreed, "but it changes what's true." She swallowed, fighting the ache building behind her sternum. "I don't want you to feel trapped," he said. "I know how this looks. I know what it costs you to be here. But if you walk away, I want it to be because you chose to, not because someone made you feel ashamed." The honesty in his voice undid her more than any kindness could have. She pressed her lips together, willing herself not to break in front of him. When she finally lifted her eyes, he was watching her with that same steady focus she remembered from the very first night, as if he'd already decided she mattered whether she liked it or not. "I'm offering you a position," he said, and her heart thumped hard against her ribs. "A position?" "My personal assistant," he said. "You'd be working with me directly." The room tilted. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "I clean rooms." "You pay attention," he said calmly. "You're not afraid to tell the truth. That's more valuable to me than any resume." 1,000 protests crowded her mind. She had no experience, no training. Everyone would assume the worst. Beneath the panic, there was a small, fierce ember of something she hadn't dared feel in years. Pride. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you never asked me for anything," he said. "Because you never tried to be anyone but yourself." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own pulse. She pushed her chair back and stood, unable to sit under the weight of it all. "I can't give you an answer right now." "I know," he said. "I don't expect you to." She started toward the door, but paused with her hand on the knob. "You realize this will ruin my reputation." "Yes," he said simply, "and it might ruin mine." She turned to face him fully. "And you don't care?" "I care more about doing something that feels honest than I do about protecting a story that isn't," he said. Her chest constricted so tightly it almost hurt. She opened the door and slipped into the hall, the hush of the penthouse closing behind her like a held breath. In the elevator, she pressed her palm to the cold metal wall, her reflection fractured in the polished surface. She didn't recognize the woman staring back, didn't know if she was someone brave or just someone reckless. When she stepped into the staff hallway, she felt the usual eyes on her. The soft hiss of whispers she no longer had the energy to decipher. She kept walking until she reached her locker. There, taped to the door, was a printout, grainy and cheap, but unmistakable. A photo of her leaving the penthouse the night before, her expression caught mid-turn, the overhead light turning her hair into a halo that didn't match the ugly implication of the image. Scrawled across the bottom in red marker were 5 words. "She's been sleeping her way up." Her vision went white around the edges. She reached for the paper with hands that didn't feel like her own, peeled it free, and crumpled it into a tight ball. It didn't matter if she was innocent. It didn't matter that nothing had happened. The story was too good, too salacious, for anyone to care about the truth. She knew then that she couldn't stay. Not here, not with the certainty that every glance would carry suspicion. That night, she packed her few belongings into a duffel bag. She wrote a note in careful blocky letters, folded it, and left it at the reception desk. "I'm sorry, I can't be someone you have to defend. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." She didn't sign it. When she walked out into the night, the city lights didn't look beautiful. They looked cold, sharp as glass. She kept walking until the Bellamy's golden facade disappeared behind her. Until she felt, for the first time in weeks, like she could finally breathe. 3 weeks passed in a blur of cheap coffee, sleepless nights, and the relentless ache of starting over. Claire never allowed herself to slow down long enough to think. The moment she stepped out of the Bellamy for the last time, She'd walked 10 blocks without stopping, her duffel bag bumping against her hip, her mind blank except for the single, steady thought: anywhere but here. She ended up in a neighborhood she hadn't set foot in since she was a teenager. Low brick buildings lined with faded awnings, cracked sidewalks where weeds pushed through the seams. A handwritten sign taped to the window of a cafe read "Help Wanted." Cash only. No questions. It felt like an answer. She went inside before she could lose her nerve. The owner, a gray-haired man named Luis, barely looked at her resume. He didn't ask what she'd done before, didn't seem interested in the tired story she had rehearsed in her head. He only nodded and said, "Can you start tomorrow?" She could. The work was simple, almost soothing in its repetition. She brewed coffee in giant silver urns, wiped down sticky tables, and learned the regulars by the way they took their cream and sugar. No one here cared what she'd done or where she'd come from. No one recognized her face from the gossip blogs. She told herself that was all she needed. But in the quiet moments, when she was rinsing mugs in the deep sink or carrying plates to the corner booth, she caught herself glancing up whenever the door chimed, half expecting to see Nathan standing in the threshold. She told herself it was only habit, but the lie tasted stale. Each night she returned to the tiny room she rented above the bakery next door. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, and the radiator clanked like an old man coughing in the dark. But it was her space, and no one there knew her name unless she offered it. The first week, she kept her phone turned off. She couldn't stand to look at it, to see the missed calls, the messages she wasn't ready to read. But on the 8th day, curiosity finally won. She turned it on and found 3 voicemails, all from numbers she didn't recognize, and one from Nathan. His voice was low, tight, like he was speaking around something he didn't trust himself to feel. "Claire, I don't know what to say that doesn't sound like I'm asking you to come back, but I want you to know I'm sorry. For all of it. For not stopping this sooner. For not protecting you better. If you need anything, He'd trailed off there, the silence stretching so long she thought the recording had ended. But then he'd added, softer, "I hope you're okay." She listened to it twice before she deleted it, not because it meant nothing, but because it meant too much. After that, she kept her phone off again. By the 3rd week, she had almost convinced herself she was starting to feel normal. The cafe was warm and dim in the early mornings, the smell of cinnamon rolls baking comforting in a way she hadn't expected. Louise paid her in cash at the end of every shift, slipping the bills into her palm without comment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it let her sleep a little easier. Then, on a gray afternoon when the sky threatened snow, everything she'd worked so hard to bury came crashing back. She was wiping down a table by the front window when the bell over the door jingled. She turned automatically, already offering a polite greeting, when her voice caught in her throat. Nathan stood just inside the doorway, his coat dusted with snow, his hair damp as though he'd walked a long way. His eyes found hers in an instant, and she felt something in her chest seize so abruptly she had to grip the back of the chair to steady herself. He didn't say anything, just stood there, studying her, as if to make sure she was real. Luis looked up from the counter. "Can I help you?" Nathan didn't look away from her. "I'm here to see Claire." She wanted to run. She wanted to tell him to leave, to pretend she'd never seen him. But her feet wouldn't move. Luis gave her a questioning look. She swallowed and nodded once, too stunned to find her voice. "Take your break," Luis said quietly. She set down the cloth and wiped her palms on her apron. When she finally stepped out from behind the counter, her legs felt hollow. Nathan waited, silent, as she led him to the farthest corner booth. She sat on the edge of the seat, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles went white. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She counted the slow beats of her pulse and tried to remember how to breathe. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her voice rough. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I am." She lifted her eyes then, and the look on his face undid her. He looked tired, older, like he hadn't slept in days. "What do you want?" she whispered. He hesitated, then slid a small black card across the table. Gold lettering shimmered under the fluorescence. She didn't pick it up. "When you're ready to stop running," he said softly, "I'd like you to come find me." She closed her eyes, pressing her fingertips to her temple. This isn't fair. I know. His voice cracked on the words, and when she looked up, she realized he wasn't hiding anything anymore. Not frustration, not regret, not the ache that mirrored her own. But none of this has been fair. A long silence settled between them. I'm not who you think I am, she whispered. I think you're exactly who I thought you were, he said. And I think you're the only person I've met in years who didn't look at me and see a paycheck. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. He took a breath, steadying himself. I'm not here to convince you. I'm not here to drag you back. I just wanted you to know that the offer still stands. What offer? To stand beside me, he said simply, to be my equal. Her throat tightened. You don't know me. I've watched you work harder than anyone in that building. I've watched you hold your head up when people tried to break you. And I watched you walk away rather than let them define you. He leaned forward, his elbows braced on the table. That's all I need to know. She pressed her hands to her face, breathing slowly until she trusted herself to look at him again. You deserve someone easier, she said finally, her voice small. I don't want easier, he replied. Something inside her cracked at that. Something she'd been holding shut since the first time he'd looked at her without pity. When she didn't speak, he rose. I'll go. He left the card on the table between them, and for a moment she stared at it like it was a live wire. As he reached the door, she found her voice. Nathan. He turned, his expression unguarded. She swallowed. I'm not ready. I know, he said gently. I'll wait. Then he was gone, the bell over the door ringing once, and the hush that fell in his wake felt impossibly heavy. Claire sat there for a long time, her hands folded over the little black card. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, like she wasn't something fragile, something to be pitied, but something to be trusted. It terrified her more than any gossip ever could. That night, she went home and placed the card on the tiny shelf by her bed. She didn't call the number written beneath his name. She didn't even touch it again. But every morning when she woke, it was the first thing she saw, and it felt like a promise she hadn't yet decided whether she would keep. In the quiet hours before dawn, she sometimes wondered if starting over was just another way of hiding. And in the space between fear and hope, she realized she was no longer sure which terrified her more, leaving everything behind, or finally daring to belong. On the morning she finally decided to stop running, Claire woke before the sun had even begun to lighten the rooftops outside her window. The city was still and gray, a hush she hadn't felt in months. She lay in bed with her eyes open, listening to the old radiator ticking softly, her breath fogging in the cold air. For a long time she didn't move, her thoughts coiling tight in her chest. She'd told herself that one day she would feel ready, that she'd know when it was time to stop hiding. But readiness, she was beginning to realize, was a story she'd invented to avoid the more complicated truth. She would never be ready. She would only ever be afraid, and either she would let the fear decide for her, or she would walk straight into it. Her hand slipped across the nightstand almost without thinking. The card Nathan had left was still there. The black surface worn soft from her fingertips, tracing the embossed letters over and over. She didn't let herself look away as she read the words again. When you're ready to stop running. She dressed slowly, buttoning her cleanest blouse and pulling her hair into a tight knot at the base of her neck. She thought about writing Louise a note. But there was nothing she could say that would explain this to anyone else. She simply left her apron folded on the counter by the register, the keys to the cafe tucked inside the pocket. The wind was sharp as she stepped onto the sidewalk. It cut through her thin coat and made her eyes water. As she waited at the crosswalk, she almost turned back twice, her feet itching to return to the safe familiarity of the cafe and the tiny room above the bakery. But each time, she imagined what it would feel like to keep shrinking herself just to avoid being seen. And the thought made her spine straighten. When she reached the glass tower where DIT Capital kept its headquarters, her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The lobby was all steel and glass, flooded with the weak, wintry light. She hesitated just inside the revolving doors, clutching the card in her pocket. A uniformed receptionist lifted her head and gave her a polished, polite smile. "May I help you?" Her voice caught in her throat for a second. Then she forced it out. "I'm here to see Nathan Hale. He told me to come." The woman's gaze flicked briefly over her plain clothes, her hair pulled back in its modest twist, and something flickered behind her professional expression, curiosity maybe, or doubt. But she only inclined her head. "Your name, please?" "Claire Moreno." "Just one moment." The receptionist picked up the phone and spoke in a low voice. Claire tried not to wring her hands, but they were clammy against the cotton of her blouse. She was half certain the woman would hang up and say Mr. Hale was unavailable, or that there had been some mistake. But then she heard a voice from across the vast lobby, and her head snapped up so quickly she almost felt dizzy. "Claire." Nathan was striding toward her, his coat draped over one arm, his hair slightly windblown. He looked as startled as she felt. For a few seconds they simply stood staring at each other, as if neither was quite convinced this was real. "You came," he said quietly, stopping a foot in front of her. She nodded once. "I didn't want to run anymore." He exhaled a slow breath, and she saw his shoulders ease. "Come upstairs." The receptionist's gaze tracked them as they walked toward the private elevator. Claire's face burned, but she didn't look back. When the doors closed behind them, sealing them in a hush of polished chrome and faint instrumental music, she felt her heart slow just enough to let her breathe again. The ride to the top floor was brief, but it felt like stepping through a threshold she couldn't return from. When the elevator chimed and the doors opened onto a carpeted corridor, Nathan gestured her ahead, his expression careful. His office was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd pictured something cold and sterile, all white walls and glass partitions. Instead, the space was warm, almost understated. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, falling across pale wood floors and shelves lined with books. A single, deep green plant sat in the corner, its leaves glossy in the light. He motioned to a pair of chairs facing each other by the window, and she sank into one, feeling suddenly exhausted. Nathan took the other seat, resting his forearms lightly on his knees. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said after a moment, "but I need you to hear me out." She swallowed. "Okay. When I offered you the job before," he began, his gaze steady, "it wasn't a favor. It wasn't pity. I meant what I said. I trust you. And not because you did anything to earn that trust in the usual sense. It's because you never tried to be someone you weren't." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know if that's enough." "Maybe it isn't," he said softly, "but I think it could be." Her chest tightened. "I don't want to be the reason people think you've lost your judgment." "If they think that," he said, "they never understood my judgment in the first place." Silence bloomed between them, not hostile but heavy with all the things they hadn't said. "I'm offering you the position again," he continued. "Personal assistant. It comes with a salary, benefits, everything you'd expect. You'd be in meetings with me, working on projects, helping manage schedules. And yes, people will talk." Her breath shook. "They already are." He nodded. "Let them. They don't get to decide what this is." She lifted her gaze to meet his. "And what is this?" His eyes searched hers, unflinching. "It's the start of something. Maybe just work, maybe something else, but I'd rather figure that out with you than spend another day pretending I don't care." A long moment passed. "I'm not ready for more," she whispered. "Not yet." "That's fine," he said. "I can wait." The steadiness in his voice did something to her, cracked open a place she'd been holding shut since the night he found her asleep in the penthouse bed. She let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can do this job." "You can," he said, so simply it made her throat close. "And if you want to try, I'll teach you everything I can." When she didn't answer, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim folder. He set it on the table between them without pushing it closer. "Take this," he said. "Look it over when you're ready. If you decide it isn't for you, I'll understand." She stared at the folder. Her name was printed neatly on the label. For some reason, that detail nearly undid her. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything," he said softly. "You don't." She pressed her palms to her eyes, breathing slowly until she trusted herself not to cry. When she looked up, he was still watching her, and she saw no trace of the man who had first looked at her with suspicion and calculation. He was only Nathan, and he was only asking her to try. When she finally reached for the folder, her hands were shaking. "I'll read it," she whispered. I can't promise more than that. That's enough, he said, and she believed he meant it. He walked her back to the elevator in silence, but as the doors slid closed, he met her gaze one last time. Whatever you decide, he said quietly, I'm glad you came. The ride down felt different. Not easier, but not as lonely as she'd feared. That evening, she sat in the little rented room with the folder open across her lap. The job description was detailed and daunting. Her eyes blurred halfway down the first page. But as she read, she felt something she hadn't dared let herself feel in too long: hope. At the very end, beneath the official documents, she found a single handwritten note in the same careful script she remembered. You belong here. Even if you can't see it yet. She closed the folder and pressed it to her chest. For the first time in months, she believed it might be true. The story of Claire and Nathan teaches us something many of us forget in the noise of everyday life. Your worth is not defined by other people's assumptions or by the worst moment you've survived. It shows how easy it is for rumors to become a cage and how hard it can be to step outside the labels people attach to you. But it also reminds us that the courage to stop running is often the beginning of becoming who you truly are. Claire's journey is proof that dignity isn't always about standing tall in the spotlight. It's sometimes about quietly refusing to let shame dictate your choices. Even when the world insists you don't belong, you can choose to claim your place anyway. You can choose honesty over appearances, integrity over fear. And when you do, you might discover that the people who see you, truly see you, will stand beside you, even when it costs them something. No matter where you start or how far you feel from the life you want, you are allowed to grow beyond what others expect of you. You are allowed to build something real from the wreckage of your mistakes and heartbreak. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to believe that your story isn't over yet, and that you deserve a chapter you write for yourself. If this story moved you or made you reflect on your own path, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story that reminds you of your own strength.